Imagine being seen, truly, utterly seen. Not just the surface, not just the smile you show the world, but the quiet, deep desires you barely admit to yourself, the secret ambition you keep locked away. And then imagine that seeing was a lie. That's where our story begins, in the gilded cage Amelia built with a man named Julian. Julian was a maestro of first impressions, a symphony of charm orchestrated solely for the public ear. He didn't just walk into a room, he commanded it, radiating a magnetic confidence that women admired and men envied. Amelia first met him at a gallery opening, feeling ordinary in her favorite navy dress when Julian, already surrounded by a glittering cohort, broke away not just to talk to her, but to focus on her as if the rest of the world had dimmed. He was a pseudo-seducer, an expert hunter who didn't scatter bait but zeroed in on the most essential need of his chosen prey, validation. He didn't compliment her dress, he complimented the nuance of her intellect, the bravery of her quiet observations. "You, Amelia," he'd whispered, leaning close enough that she could smell the expensive woodsy scent of his cologne, "are an undiscovered country, and I intend to be your first explorer." This was the love-bombing phase, a torrential downpour of praise, gifts, and intense, all-consuming attention that left her breathless and dizzy, convinced she had finally found the one person who understood the complex machinery of her soul. He moved fast, a whirlwind romance that bypassed sensible questions and went straight to future planning, painting a glorious, inescapable vision of us. The speed was intoxicating. It felt like fate, not manipulation. Within 6 months, they were married, Amelia's hands still tingling from the rush of being chosen by such a luminous creature. The shift was as subtle as a change in atmospheric pressure. The instant the ring was on her finger and the audience of friends and family dispersed, Julian's public armor hardened into private tyranny. The boundless admiration was replaced by surgical critique, the generous spirit by petty, calculated control. He was still the glorious, effortless success story out in the world, giving rousing speeches, closing deals with a charming laugh and always remembering the bartender's name. In public he was perfection, the ideal husband, attentive, witty, and effortlessly supportive of his brilliant wife. But the moment the front door closed, the mask slipped, revealing the exhausted, resentful, and utterly empty tyrant within. The energy he spent on being great in public left him depleted and vicious at home, needing to refill his ego by draining hers. The daily ritual of humiliation began innocuously. Amelia had always loved to cook, a creative outlet she cherished. Julian, initially praising her artistry, started by suggesting small improvements, a pinch more salt, a different garnish, which escalated quickly into dismissing entire meals. "Darling," he'd sigh, pushing his plate away after she'd spent hours preparing a dish, "you know, this is just adequate. You're capable of so much more, aren't you? It's a shame to waste your talent on something so pedestrian." The words weren't yelled. They were delivered with a look of profound disappointment, making her feel that she hadn't just failed a recipe, but failed him and failed herself. It was never about the food. It was always about diminishing her choices, her skills, and her confidence in her own judgment. Her public invalidation was perhaps the most painful layer of control, precisely because it was done with such exquisite finesse. At dinner parties, if Amelia attempted to contribute an opinion, perhaps a sharp, well-read observation on current politics or art, Julian would swoop in immediately. He wouldn't directly contradict her, but he would speak for her, effectively stealing her voice. "What Amelia is trying to articulate," he'd interrupt smoothly, turning to the group with a patient smile, "is the deeper, more complex economic reality. She's far too modest to get into the gritty details, but what she really means is..." And then he would launch into a 10-minute monologue of his own, using her initial thought as a launch pad for his brilliance. If Amelia's eyes met his, he'd give her a tiny, encouraging nod, as if he were protecting her from the social anxiety she didn't actually have. This tactic left her stranded, unable to protest without appearing rude or ungrateful, and making her opinions invisible to the world. She soon learned it was safer to remain silent in public, becoming the beautiful, nodding accessory he preferred. Her attempts to carve out a space for her own views, whether about a film, a book, or a major life decision, were met with immediate, calculated rejection, dressed up as concern. "That's a very simplistic way of looking at it, Amelia. I worry you haven't considered the variables," he'd say, rendering her contribution null and void before she could finish the thought. Her private choices fared worse. When she considered going back to school for a degree in museum studies, a dream she'd shelved, Julian laughed softly, a low, dismissive chuckle that cut deeper than any shout. "Museum studies, sweetheart? Really? That's for people who collect cat mugs and wear cardigans. You're my wife. You're meant for bigger things, like managing my social calendar. Besides," he'd add, leaning in with a mock sympathetic look, "you're far too sensitive for academia. They'd tear you apart." Her dream was invalidated. Not because it was bad, but because it was hers, a source of self-worth he couldn't control. Her opinions, her friendships, even the way she loaded the dishwasher was subjected to the relentless daily grind of his superiority. Arguments were never discussions. They were opportunities for him to rewrite history, gaslight her into questioning her memory, and ultimately prove that her emotional reaction was the actual problem, not his behavior. "You're too emotional, Amelia. You always blow things out of proportion. Why can't you just be reasonable?" The perverse genius of Julian's control lay in the cycle of pain and healing. He possessed an absurd, almost clinical capacity to injure her deeply, only to then immediately transform into her emotional nurse. After a particularly vicious verbal attack, when Amelia would finally collapse into tears, broken and exhausted, the tyrant would instantly vanish. In his place was the deeply concerned, loving husband who held her close. "Oh, my poor, sensitive darling," he would murmur, stroking her hair. "I'm so sorry I pushed you too hard. It's only because I have such high expectations for you, but you're clearly worn out. Let me take care of you." He would brew her tea, run her a bath, or offer to cancel their social plans, making himself the sole source of comfort for the wound he had inflicted. This calculated empathy was the ultimate trap. It reassured Amelia that the core of him was good, and that his cruelty was just an unfortunate high-pressure flaw. It made her dependent on him not only for her pain, but for the fleeting, precious relief, strengthening the psychological chains that bound her. But the most bewildering aspect of his manipulation was his emotional amnesia. The morning after a night of devastating cruelty, after he had reduced her to tears with calculated insults and accusations, Julian would wake up radiating sunshine. He would enter the kitchen whistling, genuinely surprised to find Amelia looking drawn. "Morning, gorgeous. Did you sleep well? I've already booked us that trip to Florence. Isn't that exciting?" If Amelia, hesitantly, tried to reference the previous night's assault, his face would transform into a mask of pure, innocent confusion. He would tilt his head, eyebrows furrowed, the picture of befuddled concern. "Last night? What on earth are you talking about, my love? I was perfectly normal. We watched that old film and went to bed early. Did you have a bad dream? You know how dramatic your dreams can be." This deliberate, performance-level doing of nothing was gaslighting perfected. He didn't just deny his actions. He made her feel utterly unhinged for remembering them. His innocent, bewildered face was a silent, terrifying message. "The problem is not me. The problem is your memory, your sanity, your grip on reality." This capacity to reset, to make believe nothing happened, was what truly kept Amelia trapped, forcing her to confront the possibility that her decade of suffering was nothing more than a fiction of her own volatile mind. Years passed in this suffocating, cyclical nightmare. She lost touch with her best friends because Julian found them dull and, frankly, slightly common. She gave up painting because Julian suggested her studio smelled too chemical for his refined nose. She stopped reading books she loved because he'd interrupt her with condescending summaries of the plot, proving he could absorb the information faster and more efficiently. She was a ghost in her own home, tethered to the reality Julian constructed for them both. The moment that finally shattered the mirror came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Amelia was organizing their tax documents, a task Julian deemed beneath him, when she found a letter. It wasn't a mistress or a financial scandal. It was a simple, stark thank you note from a former colleague, praising Julian for his incredible and generous mentorship during a difficult time. The note described a man of profound empathy, patience, and selflessness, a man Amelia had never once seen in their decade of marriage. In that moment, holding the paper, the full sickening truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Julian wasn't a flawed man. He was a performance artist. The generous mentor, the charismatic leader, the loving husband in public, it was all an expertly crafted character designed to elicit the maximum possible supply of admiration. And she, Amelia, was not his partner, but his audience, his scapegoat, and his personal punching bag, a backstage area where he could drop his mask and vent his self-hatred onto a safe target. The realization wasn't anger, it was cold, crystalline clarity. She didn't love him. She loved the character he had played for 6 months. The feeling wasn't heartbreak, it was the sudden immense relief of knowing she wasn't crazy. Her reality was valid. That Tuesday afternoon marked the day of liberation. She didn't confront him. Confrontation was his stage, and she knew he would twist her evidence into proof of her paranoia. Instead, she became as silent and efficient as a thief. She began to plan, meticulously and secretly. She opened a separate bank account, not a joint one, but one only she knew about, funding it with the small residuals from a freelance writing job he barely noticed. She reached out to the one friend he hated most, Sarah, claiming she needed help with an emergency, subtly reactivating the lifeline she had cut years ago. She digitally archived every email, every text message, every subtle put-down he had ever sent, creating a document titled Reasonable in case she ever needed to prove her sanity. She did all of this while Julian was performing his life outside, convinced she was still his obedient echo. For 3 months, she smiled, nodded, and perfected the art of non-existence, saving every spare ounce of emotional energy for the escape. The actual liberation was anticlimactic and clean. Julian was away on a week-long business trip, a grand affair in the city where he could gather maximum adulation. Amelia packed 2 suitcases, one for clothes, one for her old sketchbooks, journals, and a collection of forgotten vinyl records she hadn't dared play in years. She left him a single, simple letter, placed on his bedside table next to his empty spot. Julian, the performance is over. I am leaving. Do not contact me. She didn't wait for his reaction. Sarah met her with a hired moving truck and a cup of lukewarm coffee, and together they drove Amelia to a small, sun-drenched apartment she had rented months ago, tucked away in a vibrant neighborhood Julian would have called trashy. The first few weeks were a confusing mix of terror and utter, profound silence. The silence was the hardest part. For so long, the noise of his judgment had been the soundtrack of her life. She expected him to materialize, demanding her return, but Julian didn't chase her. He didn't need her. He needed the idea of her, the victim status she gave him, and the audience she provided. His narcissism meant he couldn't fathom that she had truly escaped his orbit. He likely spun a narrative to his colleagues about her instability and moved quickly to find his next source of supply. Amelia was free, but she was broken. She had to unlearn every lesson he had taught her: how to choose a restaurant, how to dress without fear of critique, how to trust her own memory. It took months of therapy, months of slowly, painstakingly rebuilding her sense of self from the shattered pieces. She put up her old easel and started painting again, splashing colors onto the canvas that were bright and defiant. She went back to school part-time. She reconnected with all the friends he had discarded. The happy ending wasn't a new romance or sudden wealth. It was the quiet, glorious realization that she was enough. She stood in her living room one evening, listening to a jazz record surrounded by her bold, slightly clumsy paintings, sipping a glass of wine she chose, and planning a weekend trip she wanted. She looked in the mirror, and for the first time in over a decade she saw herself. Not Julian's reflection, not Julian's echo, but Amelia, brave, intelligent, and fiercely, beautifully whole. She was no longer a stage for someone else's performance. She was the star of her own life, and the show had just begun. Her liberation was total, profound, and entirely, irrevocably her own. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please subscribe. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.